increasing the tariffs in the 1930s really was a disastrous consequence for the recovery from the Great Depression. Shielding your economy from outside competition in the long run is not efficient. It is not a way how to achieve long-run economic growth. This is immensely dynamic economy, which, despite the fact that they were shielded from UK, achieved high growth.
Hello, I'm Daniel Freeman. Today we'll be discussing the history of tariffs in America and whether they were responsible for America's rise as an industrial power. To do so, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Alexander Klein, Professor of Economic History at the University of Sussex, who has written a paper on just this topic. Okay, so start with a fairly basic question. What are tariffs and why are they controversial among economists?
Well, tariffs are taxes, but not on taxes on the goods produced in the national economy. Now, taxes produced on anything that's produced outside national economy. Now, why are they controversial? I would say they have a distributional consequences on the economy. It really matters who pays the tariff and who doesn't. And since tariffs as a tax, raises the cost of production for those who pay tariffs, raises the price of consumers, those who buy foreign goods, is going to affect the decision-making of firms, decision-making of consumers, and it is going to be controversial. Now, it's controversial among economists in economics profession. Analyzing tariffs in economic model is a complex endeavor. And depending what is the structure of the model, what kind of assumptions economists make about the model, you can get different results. Having said that, I think there is a fairly broad agreement about the impact of tariffs in general on the economy. What economists will, I wouldn't say disagree, would have a different take depending on what kind of model they have in mind. They differ in what is the overall impact, who suffers more, who suffers less, what is the long-run impact of tariffs. But because tariffs are it's a genuinely challenging task to analyze, you're gonna have quite a wide range of opinions. What is their effects on the economy?
Okay, so your research focuses on tariffs in the US, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, as the US is industrializing. What was the US's tariff regime like then by comparison to, say, today?
Oh, it was a high tariff rate regime, very high. And United States was known as, from the tariff perspective, a quite closed economy, in the sense that the tariff rates on average were over 40%, and there was a quite a range of tariffs. So for some products, you can have a tariff as high as almost 100%. For other products, you can have a tariff as high as 20%. But compared to today, it was a very high tariff economy. Even the tariffs that has been introduced during the first Donald Trump administration, and they basically kept during the President Biden's administration, can be considered on average relatively low to what the U.S. economy at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, what kind of tariffs they had.
Yeah. So I read in your paper that in 1870, the average tariff for all goods coming into the US was 45%.
Yes.
Which just, I was looking up the figures for the current general tariff on goods coming into the US, and it's more like 2% currently. Yeah. Now, the Trump administration are talking about increasing it to, say, 10%, maybe even 20%. But yeah, it sort of gives you a sense of like just how high these tariff barriers were. And why was this? What was the justification? Was it just to raise revenue, or was there anything else going on?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and there is a long scholarship which tries to understand why tariffs were so high in the United States in the 90s, early 20th century, and what was their impact. Now, the paper that we wrote with Chris Meissner focuses on the so-called post-bellum or post-Civil War United States, where tariffs were very high. But I need to say something about the tariffs before the Civil War in order to put high tariff rates from about 1870 until 1910 into wider perspective. So when the United States was created, so to speak, there was a notion what kind of trade policy the United States should implement. There were strong voices that it should be protectionist trade policy to have high tariffs in order to shield domestic manufacturers from the competition coming mostly from Great Britain. There is an economic argument, there is a strong political argument, and there's a general notion. I mean, American colonies was fighting against Great Britain. So yes, we want to shield ourselves against those, pesky British producers who can, flood our markets with high tariffs. That would be, general argument which you can find in newspapers, in talking in taverns. But economic arguments were quite sound. There's an infant industry in the United States which needs to develop, and we need to protect that infant industry from quite developed industries, manufacturing industries in Great Britain. Now, this infant industry argument is important and tricky at the same time. You do want to have tariffs which help you to develop your own manufacturing sector, but also you need to know where exactly to pull out, when to lower the tariffs, because shielding your economy from outside competition in the long run is not efficient. It is not a way how to achieve long-run economic growth. Going back to the United States, during antebellum years or antebellum decades, which is before the Civil War, initially tariffs were quite high, reaching on average about 30%. But as I said earlier, tariffs have distributional consequences, and there was a sectional difference in the attitudes toward tariffs. Southern parts of the United States were highly against them. Northern parts of the United States were for them. Why this difference? Northern parts of the United States were the ones that were most industrialized by contemporary standards, while the southern parts of the United States, or states which are known for having slavery before the Civil War, focus mostly on the export of agricultural products and import of manufacturing products. So they will be the ones bearing the brunt of high tariffs, and they didn't like it naturally. So there was a political fight, and after 1830s, tariffs dropped down. So dropped down to about 10-15% on average, but then Civil War hits, and during the Civil War, tariffs spiked up because they needed revenues.
Yeah.
Okay. They need revenues. Now, after Civil War is gone, the question is what to do with tariffs. Should we go back to what the tariff regime was before the Civil War, or should we continue high tariffs? Now, because those which were the brunt of high tariffs before the Civil War were the southern states of the United States, and they lost the Civil War. In the U.S. Congress, who was dominating, those were the, so to speak, winning states. And they made sure that this high tariff regime, which occurred during the Civil War, persisted during the post-bellum or post-Civil War era. Although the picture is quite complex. There was a lot of infights. There were changes in the tariffs. They were going up and down. But southern states or Democratic Party did not really have enough of political power to completely overturn this new regime of high tariff rates, which lasted as a continuation of the tariffs which were imposed during the Civil War.
Yeah. So I found this really interesting in your paper, is how it's not so much a sort of clear, coherent policy of like industrial strategy, at least in this period. It seems to be much more industry specific lobbying from, primarily, as you mentioned, northern Republican industrialists trying to sort of get tariffs imposed to protect their own profit margins, basically. Are there any industries where which sort of industries are most effective in getting protectionist tariffs put up, and which manufacturers are less effective or perhaps less interested in tariffs?
That's an extremely important question you're asking. Something that we spent a long time carefully thinking and researching. And what I'm gonna present here is my opinion. So one thing that we first of all need to realize is that United States was operating within the high tariff regime. So having high tariffs on average 40%, was a normal day. Okay, that's what all industries were exposed to. We really didn't have something like, okay, there's industries with zero tariffs and industries with high tariffs. There are few imported goods which had zero tariffs, but this was really, really marginal. And I'm saying is, in order to realize the mindset of politicians, mindset of industrialists, mindset of workers, that's what we have. We live in the high tariff era. The reason I'm saying is that when you look at the arguments that I put forward, why to have tariffs, it's immensely interesting because the range of arguments really varies. And who was more successful to implement it, that is really depended on how strong they were in influencing their congressmen. But all of them, literally all of them, irrespective whether it was inefficient firm which was losing customers or whether it was highly efficient, productive firm, they all use arguments of tariffs. For instance, wagon industry and wagons, like one of the main means of transportation, carriages as well, they were dying out at the end of the 19th century. And they really tried very hard to impose tariffs on imports which were threatening their existence. They eventually, they lost it, but they were trying very, very hard. So these are the example of industries which were inefficient, they were dying out, and they tried to push through Congress protections. But then you had also industries which were very efficient. But if you are efficient in high production, you're also probably very efficient in lobbying. Now, as a firm which is very efficient and it's rich, has a lot of resources, would you like to have a competition? Not necessarily. Would any firm in the history would like to have a competition? Now, when you look at the history and look today, firms which are successful and they're very efficient, they try to limit competition. So you don't want to have it. If you have means to do it, you will do so. So you'll see in the U.S. Congress, and I read thousands of pages of hearings in front of the Committee of Ways and Means, arguments which were put forward. And when the congressman asked a question to successful industrialists in, let's say, furniture industry, why do you need tariffs? You are so efficient. You employ a lot of people, you have a high profits. And the answer was, well, other industries have tariffs. Why should I be discriminated by not having tariffs on the imports from other countries? So I think this very well captures what I said, that they live in the high tariff high tariff decades. It was a normal thing. So even if from economic efficient perspective, it didn't make sense. They didn't need the tariffs. They asked for them because it made their life slightly easier. Yeah. And if others had, why should we? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting dynamic. But you do still see that there were some differences between different industries. So one of the ones I found quite interesting was paper tended to have quite low tariffs. And you suggest that's in part because the publishing industry was actually in that one case lobbying against tariffs because it's a big input cost. Do you have any sense of why more industries didn't sort of lobby against tariffs for their own inputs? So say if you're making steam engines, for example, wouldn't you want the tariff on, say, imported steel to be lower?
You would, absolutely. You would, but so you would lobby for the lower tariffs on steel, but then you have iron and steel conglomerates, which lobby the other way. And which way it goes, it really depends on the strength of your. I mean, I'm using the word lobbying. I mean, I don't want to be completely ahistorical. You try to influence your congressman, and lobbying legislature, lobbying effort was certainly different in the 19th century United States than it is now. Just to make this point, so that we are not completely ahistorical. But what we know from research is that at the end of the day, when it comes to which imported products had, let's say, 20% tariffs, which imported products had 35% tariff, whether it was ad valorem or specific tariff, was almost like a horse trading on the in the committees of the U.S. Congress. Let's say there's a congressman which has nothing to lose, okay, and other congressman approaches him. Other side is mostly men or exclusively men. Look, I have this company. It would really help me if tariffs went up politically. You have nothing to lose. Can you support me? And in exchange, okay, I can support you in some other measures you feel strongly about in the future. So that was also this kind of political horse trading. And this brings me to one of the things that you brought up earlier. Was there any trade policy as we know today in the United States? I will go and say, based on my research, no. I mean, that really wasn't. It was inconceivable that there would be like coherent trade policy towards a U.S. manufacturing. And it is not that inconceivable to understand. This was a regime of laissez-faire. This was the era when government tried to really not interfere too much. I mean, this kind of era, the government should play either positive or negative role in affecting the policy. That's post-World War II. But in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, it influenced through tariffs, through decision whether to stay on gold or go out gold, but having like board of economic advisors advising what would be the best national economic policy, that by and large wasn't the case.
Okay. So we've talked about how the US ended up with this very high tariff regime, very protectionist environment. What, from your research, were the effects on American manufacturing?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, we asked this question because that is quite a debate in economic history literature. What was the role of tariffs? And in the light of recent political events, people start to be even more interested. And United States at the time, just to give you a little bit of context, was industrializing really heavily, was growing very fast. And research by Steve Broadbury and Doug Irving showed that the United States, in terms of aggregate labor productivity, overtook Great Britain by the end of the 19th century. And it was a big deal because Great Britain was the first industrializing economy, was the major industrialized economy, was the leader. So to overtake the leader, that's a big deal. Now, we know that tariffs were very high, so there is an association between U.S. booming in terms of economic performance, overtaking the UK, and high tariffs. Now, is that association causal? Okay, really, can we say that high tariff regime caused or substantially helped the U.S. To become industrial leader by the turn of the 20th century? And what we show in our research is that most likely not. What happened is that high tariffs had negative effect on labor productivity. We focus on labor productivity as a measure, as our preferred measure of productivity. So on average, we can say that tariffs were not behind American industrial success at the turn of the 20th century. That's labor productivity. However, if we were to look at other variables that policymakers might be interested in, let's say employment, then the picture is slightly different. That yes, the tariffs lead to higher employment. But if your policy objective is to have high employment and only high employment in the economy, why not? Tariffs, okay, it's one way how to achieve it. But I mean, we know that from the long-run perspective, it's the labor productivity of the economy which matters for the rising standard of living. So if you really care about labor productivity, then tariffs is not the way to go.
Yeah.
Story is slightly more complex in the sense that we found enormous heterogeneity in our data. So we do have a handful of industries in which we found that, yes, high tariffs actually increase labor productivity. So, I mean, my favorite example is industry group of scientific instruments. So at the time, German was really a leader in scientific instruments. That was in terms of research development, and it was a science itself. That was the country to be. I mean, Nobel Prize winners measure advances in chemistry, physics. That's Germany. So they knew how to produce scientific instruments for chemical labs or for labs in general very well. And so what they found that actually high tariffs on the scientific instruments actually increases the labor productivity in the United States. Now, I have to say that we reached a wall in the sense that the area of production of scientific instruments in the United States at the end of the 19th century is under-researched. We know very little actually how the scientific instruments were produced. So all we can do is to make a conjecture that most likely will happen that United States producers of scientific instruments were shielded for highly efficient producers coming from the continental Europe, and they managed, to take advantage of high tariffs to develop their efficient way of increasing labor productivity in that particular sector. But I will say as a disclaimer that I would love to see more research done in the particular industry, which we show actually benefited from high tariffs. But on average, this is not the case.
So if I can summarize you, the general trend across the economy is that when you have higher tariffs in an industry, it seems to reduce productivity because you're basically shifting workers from more efficient industries into less efficient industries because you're giving them protection.
Yeah. So you protect less efficient firms. So what you find really is small and medium-sized firms survive. Small and medium-sized firms are usually not very high productive in terms of labor productivity. So tariffs offer them a shield, a protection. They could coexist together in the United States. So what we find that once you build a tariff wall, those firms, find a niche in the American market and they can survive. But without that tariff, they probably wouldn't.
Yeah. So if we're sort of imagining counterfactuals, imagine, let's say, if the US had gone down a free trade line after 1870, how would US industrialization have changed, do you think, relative to what actually happened?
That's a very good counterfactual question. To analyze that, we will need to have a full-blown general equilibrium model, something that me and my co-author are thinking about as a follow-up to the paper. But let me offer a conjecture. Let me offer a conjecture of what might have happened. So my conjecture will be based on what we know about industrialization in the United States at that time and what really mattered for industrialization. So we know that the United States overtook Great Britain in terms of labor productivity because of high investments into capital stock. It was the capital stock that really drove the productivity, not total factor productivity, not the way you organize your economy, not so much technological progress. This was more or less at par with the UK, but it was the capital stock which really propelled the US or made U.S. better than
As
UK.
in, it has more and better machines per worker than Britain.
Exactly, yeah. But it's a huge economy. I mean, the size of the United States is enormous. Now, this may be advantage, maybe disadvantage. The United States turned it into its advantage. It integrated its whole continent throughout the course of the 19th century, and by the end of the 19th century, certainly the most industrialized part of the United States, in the what was called what researchers later coined as manufacturing belt, even the South, it was dense railway network. You go to the West, you have your railway lines. So when it comes to places like California, it joins in terms of industrial output the United States slightly later on, but the majority of the eastern part is highly integrated. So you have an integrated market. Transportation costs are low. You don't have barriers to trade across states. So you cannot really impose tariffs when you move your goods from New York to New Jersey, or you go from Kentucky to Tennessee, for instance. So that helps enormously. You have an influx of immigrants coming from Europe, which helps. And recent research tries to establish a link between the influx of immigrants and technological progress. Enormously dynamic economy. It was a brutal economy. Don't get me wrong, right? It's you go to the United States and you wanna not only survive, you wanna succeed. And it's an immense drive. So you have a population which really wants to achieve something. So this is immensely dynamic economy, which, despite the fact that they were shielded from UK, achieved high growth. My conjecture would be you remove tariffs. Now, some industries, might suffer from a higher competition coming from the UK. But in general, my sense would be that US would have overcome UK even earlier than at the turn of the 20th century. It would be not only in terms of labor productivity, but also total factor productivity, which means that it would be way more efficient how to utilize both labor and capital. And it would be even bigger industrially than that it turned out to be.
Right. That's really fascinating, because I suppose there's this tendency to sort of look at a country that's rapidly industrializing and then look at everything it does and just sort of assume, oh, well, it must be industrializing because it is doing X, Y, Z. But what you're actually suggesting is that US industrialization, it had a lot of other merits, like there being, a huge internal market, a lot of competition in this market, low transportation costs, huge supply of labor coming in from Europe. And that meant that they're actually able to overcome the problems resulting from the tariff regime. Yeah. No,
it's a country which has vast natural resources, which has been shown to be important for industrialization. We shouldn't forget about the fact that it was a highly urbanized economy, and that the concentration of manufacturing was what was later called as a manufacturing belt. And these agglomeration economies have mostly positive effect on labor productivity. And in one of my other papers, I show that actually, yes, being in densely populated areas, densely populated cities, these agglomeration economies have positive effect on labor productivity. So you put all those things together, okay, and you get, rapidly evolving, rapidly industrializing, and successful economy. It didn't have to be. There's nothing prescribed in the history that U.S. had to end up the way it ended up. So scholars, of course, argue which one was more important, which wasn't more important. I tend to see this that you look at an extremely socioeconomic complex, which is very difficult to describe it with one word and one factor. So you look at it from different angles. You have different factors, and when you put them all together, then you get the dynamic economy. You take 2 or 3 out of the equation, and the way US developed could have been different. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and but one of the other interesting things about this period is you do actually see average tariffs start to come down, particularly by the very end of the 19th century. So I think it's 45% average tariff down to 30% in 1900. And then you get this idea of reciprocity. So removing tariffs to the US in return for other countries doing that, removing their own tariffs. Does this seem to have a particular? I know this is slightly after the period of your paper, but does this start to have a positive impact on US trade and the US economy after this starts being implemented in the 1930s?
Well, I mean, we are entering a very difficult period when you disentangle what is the effect of tariffs on performance of US economy starts to be tricky. But so we are entering interwar period. And the interwar period, we have 1920s, and historians call it a roaring 1920s because really labor productivity, I mean, productivity in general, total factor productivity was really very, very high. I mean, there were Second Industrial Revolution really kicks in at the time, and my favorite example is a kitchen van. Okay, except for the microwave and the dishwasher, basically what we have in the kitchen nowadays is the result of the Second Industrial Revolution and its impact on the white goods, and that started emerging in the 1920s. We have radio, we have improvement of transportation, further improvement of transportation. And then we have Great Depression, okay? And the Great Depression hits at the end of the 1920s. And in the United States, it's really the impact, it lasts quite a long time. From 1930s, I mean, President Roosevelt tries to do something, but there's complications with monetary policy in the second half of the 1930s. So, and countries start protecting themselves, and again, they start raising tariffs. And increasing the tariffs in the 1930s really was a disastrous consequence for the recovery from the Great Depression. And especially you get to the late 1930s and you are on the eve of the Second World War. So when Churchill said this interwar period is the second 30 Years' War, he wasn't that wrong. He wasn't that off mark, because this is so unbelievably difficult. But one thing that economists tend to agree is that increasing in the tariffs and basically closing themselves even more during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, was not helpful, to say it mildly. That had a negative impact on the recovery from the Great Depression. And I'm gonna say something slightly outrageous. I would say that after the Second World War, that was a bit of a lesson learned from the 1930s and from the high tariffs and environment. There was a systematic efforts were made to keep lowering tariffs in the post-World War II era. It took many decades. It was tumultuous process. It wasn't that straightforward, but there was at least an intention and understanding that let's not go back to what we lived through, because it really doesn't make sense. It seems like nowadays we are as if forgotten this interwar period mayhem that happened, and seems like protectionism is again the most favorite word, and is a thing as a way how to get out of whatever economic problems are there.
Yeah. I mean, it's it's very interesting that after World War II, you get things like, the global agreement on the general agreement on tariffs, and then later on you get the establishment of the World Trade Organization, and until the last 5 to 10 years, people would have assumed that the reduction in tariffs, the expansion of free trade is almost an inevitable trend of history, and it's just we've reached the end of history. We're down to I think the UK collects, 0.5% of all government revenues is from tariffs. In the US, it's about 2%. But now we're seeing a revival of this, particularly in the United States. Do you think this sort of Gilded Age period gives us any lessons for today on just what to expect if we do go back down this road of, high tariffs, industrial protection, that kind of thing?
Well, I do believe so that we can learn some lessons from Gilded Age. Of course, we cannot make one-to-one comparison. This was a different era, different way of thinking about it. But and one thing that is what the paper strongly suggests is that tariffs in general are really not great for labor productivity. Yeah. They are okay for employment, as I said earlier, and it's up to the policymakers to decide what do they prefer. You prefer, rise in employment, or you prefer rise in labor productivity. It seems like almost a trade-off, but I was born and raised under communism, where full employment was the goal, and everyone was employed, and labor productivity was not. They talked about it, that policy was biased towards high employment, and it wasn't great. It was actually very poor productivity. It was very low, and in the long run, really the only what matters for economic performance is productivity, whether labor productivity or total effective productivity. So what our paper suggests is that the economy, which is booming and is great, and U.S. economy has been doing very well over the past few years. You impose tariffs, you might not destroy the economy, but you certainly lower the labor productivity in the manufacturing sector, which in the long run will not have positive impact on the U.S. economy. It can't. Now the question is, what is the long run? Long run is usually longer than one election cycle. What our paper also suggests that you increase the tariffs, employment will go up. So if your time horizon is one election cycle, then imposing tariffs is from the perspective of a politician, the way to go. Now, current U.S. administration has only one potential, one life cycle, one election cycle. After that, by constitution, President Trump cannot run to be the president. What worries me a little bit is that the notion that tariff or high tariffs are good for the economy permeated the thinking. I don't want to say across society. U.S. is widely diverse heterogeneous society, but at least reading through U.S. outlets, there's a debate. Some argue it's not good, some not. But the very fact that you debate the merits of high tariffs and that tariffs can have some positive effect on productivity is troubling, because, if one thing that economists would agree by and large is that curtailing your markets from competition cannot have productivity enhancing effects in general. Maybe some particular cases, yes, but in general, no. So just to wrap it up, in general, when you have a booming economy, as diverse and dynamic economy as the US, you impose the tariffs. What you can expect on average that your labor productivity will go down. And then it's up to the electorate of the United States whether they are happy with having low labor productivity and high employment, or whether they are happy or whether they are not happy having a low labor productivity and high employment. That's what I would say. That's one of the trade-offs that our paper points to.
And also on one level, presumably it is the consumer that is the American consumer that is paying for this as well.
Absolutely. Our paper doesn't even touch upon this, but absolutely, you increase the tariffs, you raise the price of what American consumer pays. Not only that, now something they could not really capture fully in the paper due to data limitations, but there are what we call input-output linkages or supply chain linkages.
Yeah.
A lot of American firms import goods from abroad. So tariffs will be raised on them, so they will be forced to
pay more
price, maybe if not run out of business, at least figure out how to operate in an environment when high tariffs are imposed. What I worry about is that they get used to it, and then US will be operating again in the high tariff environment as in the Gilded Age. Once you get into the regime where high tariffs are accepted as a way to go, then you have build up and cumulative inefficiencies, and then that's gonna be this cannot have, long run positive effect on the labor productivity. So my worry really is just so that US doesn't slip again into the mindset of high tariffs, fine, no problem. We figure out how to do it without them, because they lived in an era where there were no tariffs and things were not that bad. Almost feel bad saying this, because if there is an unemployed worker in Pennsylvania or Ohio, Indiana, which really suffered because of the globalization, then I don't want to sound presumptuous and arrogant, but in the long run, really tariffs are not great for labor productivity and for standard of living.
Yeah. Well, okay. I think on that warning, unfortunately rather topical warning, I think we're going to have to come to an end here. But Alex, thank you so much for coming on. As I mentioned, Alexander Klein and Christopher Meissner's working paper, Did Tariffs Make American Manufacturing Great?, is available, and we've put a link to that down in the description, so do have a read of that. And if you would like to see more interviews on economic history, tariffs, and related things, don't forget to subscribe.